Who do you think is Satoshi Nakamoto? Do you know?
So I risked spending the rest of my life in jail to set cryptography free.
Yes or no, David? Are you Satoshi? Yes or no?
The godfather of it all, David, can you take us back to 81, 82? Talk to us how you're thinking about the development of cryptography back then.
Powerful force in my youth was the idea that the world, it was going to go off in the wrong direction and it really needed some help.
My office mate was Eric Schmidt. Maybe you've heard of him.
You are the former CEO of Google.
Bill Joy, another founder's son, was kind of around the corner.
From the early days of his youth, David was a rebellious character who dedicated his life for the betterment of democracy. He was going to achieve it by working on cryptography and creating tools that would enhance the digital privacy of future generations.
The DARPA funding, they always had the tagline, their posters and stuff, DARPA, a mission-oriented agency. And so I thought, I'm going to be a mission-oriented agency. And I really decided just to devote myself to trying to use cryptography to make the world more, let's say, democratic. And that was my mission. And I've basically stuck with that over the last 40 years,
But the clouds above the cryptography research started getting darker and darker.
We think of the web as a natural, thing that most people think it just sort of came with the planet. But it didn't. It was very, very hard fought. Adam mentioned the crypto wars without calling them that. The government was sending letters and saying, don't have sessions on cryptography. And, being a relatively Berkeley young guy, caught up in the whole atmosphere there, and I thought, there's only one thing to do, and that is to organize a conference on cryptography. I did it all by in-person conversations and and I mailed out invitations. International scientific associations are protected by the United Nations.
There was a handful of people attending in suits, kind of like with their name badges all said, private citizen from, Laurel, Maryland.
Which, if you know anything about the NSA, that's where they are. And so when I announced that they were all now members of this International Scientific Association for Cryptologic Research, they turned green and it was over.
Where it was a great victory of privacy-enhancing tools for the public, the crypto wars were just starting. In the 1990s, the cyberpunk movement was born, and many people in it were promoting cryptography for public use. The Bitcoin white paper was originally released to cypherpunk mailing list members. But many years before that, in the early 1990s, David Chaum created the first ecash transaction on the internet. It was based on his research from the 1980s.
Chaumian ecash was designed from the start by David Chaum to be something where you could somehow have it be untraceable. And they literally used the word untraceable.
So as a private person, where you spend your money is your own business.
It would be kind of like not politically very convenient to talk to regulators and say, oh, I've invented an untraceable form of digital cash nowadays. But back in the 80s when he first came up with that idea, that's what he had in his mind.
The idea that a number could be worth money. In some sense, you could call it Bitcoin zero. So the deal was, if you put up a shop and accepted ecash, I would give you 100 cyberbucks. And there was, it wasn't we just said, well, we're going to have a million. It was limited. I was invited to a lot of central banks and, Visa International and Citibank and all these. I was sitting there in the boardrooms and meeting the executives. They'd come to visit me and, all this stuff. So, there was a lot of interest in what we were doing.
eCash was a popular story in its time. It was a proper electronic currency. And even though it didn't have the idea of blockchain and proof of work in it, it was close enough to today's altcoins. It was centrally mined and controlled, but with greater privacy. And electronic money was the next hot thing in tech. Many corporations showed interest in buying the Digicash, the eCash parent company. And Bill Gates wanted to integrate eCash into Windows 95 and is said to have offered Digicash about $100 million to do so. The story goes that Chaum asked for $2 for each version of Windows 95 sold. The deal was off.
There was even a plan, I think, for ING Barings and Goldman Sachs to bring Digicash to the stock market. And Bill Gates expressed interest in integrating it with Windows 95. Netscape expressed interest. Visa wanted to invest $40 million. And none of these potential deals happened. And in subsequent reporting, I guess some sources say that you wanted too much control, and employees also felt you were too paranoid or greedy or stubborn, and that's why these deals fell through.
The fault for not being able to bring ecash to the masses is pinned mostly on David. According to his co-workers, he didn't want to let go of the technology that he spent a decade on, and regulators started getting interested in this new, centrally issued electronic money with all these privacy characteristics. But the nail in the coffin was the time period. In 1994, Internet network was just getting to the public and was definitely in the infancy stage, nothing close to the network and computing power we have these days.
And in those days, there wasn't enough computing power globally at any kind of reasonable cost to even entertain the idea of the kind of blockchains that we have today. It wasn't that easy to install the client software and get it to work, and everyone had different versions of different operating systems, and computers were very slow for processing all this, and we were using modems and all that, so it was kind of hard to compete with credit cards and all that.
And even though ecash and Digicash failed and subsequently filed for bankruptcy in 1998, David and his ideas were still alive. The new generation was brewing, and the cypherpunks were the most influential group that was pushing information and cryptography freedom forward in the late 90s and early 2000s. Satoshi Nakamoto himself was part of the cypherpunk movement.
You could divide it into roughly two camps, one of them inspired by David and very interested in privacy, and so using encryption, public key cryptography, using David's technology involving mixes, which eventually became Tor, for example, and digital cash, blinded digital cash, but not really interested in new currencies or reforming the money or that kind of thing.
So I really pioneered a lot of that stuff, and I think that's what inspired the cypherpunk movement. I mean, that's what everyone says.
And a lot of ideas about electronic money and methods to achieve it that he worked on in the early 80s were present in the early version of Bitcoin as well as the white paper. There are some who would connect David with the Satoshi figure.
I did want to thank you for inventing pretty much all this and giving us all jobs.
The conversations you might have had in those early days, were you on the chats with Satoshi at the time?
Well, I'd rather not comment on that, but
why not?
I've known a lot of key people in the field.
But all these voices seem to forget that David always had a privacy-first attitude. He wouldn't let Bitcoin to be so transparent.
Don't forget, governments are usually ahead. They will co-opt whoever is ahead because it gives them a tremendous advantage, and they won't announce it. You look at passenger ships were sunk during the Second World War, but the U.S. government knew it, but they didn't do anything because they didn't want to reveal that they'd broken the code. So who knows? Maybe some people have. But privacy is something that needs to be protected forever.
These days, David is working on his new project called ELixxir, which is a messaging system built on the quantum-resistant cryptography and heavily anti-metadata centered. Last time I checked, it didn't have much traction in the app stores, but these are the times we live in. People don't care about their privacy anymore.
Don't be an idiot, don't be fooled. If the systems you're working with don't do a really good job of hiding the IP addresses and the like, payload sizes, timing, and so forth, then you might as well just be sending your messages in the clear to the government.
In the cryptocurrency space, we need more people like David, who could engineer simple but powerful solutions and who understand the underlying issues.
Watch out for proof of greed. If we can do that,